Good morning, everyone, and welcome to St. Luke's Sunday Forum. We are thrilled to have you join us here at St. Luke's Episcopal Church in downtown Atlanta. And I'm even more excited to welcome one of my newest and best friends, Rabbi Peter Berg, the senior rabbi of the temple just down the street in the neighborhood, a man of great spiritual and religious leadership in a place of great historic significance, both in terms of Judaism in Atlanta, but also in our country. So welcome, Rabbi. It's so great to have you.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here with friends. This is really fun.
Oh, good. Well, St. Luke's loves you.
Well, I feel the same way.
People are very excited about your being here. So rather than my messing up an introduction, I would love it if you would take a minute first before we get into the content for you to talk a little bit about how long have you been in Atlanta, how long have you been at the temple, your educational background, etc.
Sure. I have been in Atlanta for 12 years. I'm originally from New Jersey, but I feel like after 12 years, I feel like I'm the real thing now. I still talk a little bit like I'm from New Jersey, but I really feel like I'm here. My education, I'm here with my wife and my 3 kids. Educationally, I went to college at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. My parents say they sent me there because they were sick of sending me to Washington, D.C. to march and protest every weekend, and they would just make it easier. So that's where I went to school, and I loved being in the center of it all. And then I went to Rabbinical School at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, which is the Reformed Jewish Movement seminary. First year in Jerusalem and then 4 years in New York City. And then 3 pulpits. My first was at Temple Emmanuel in Dallas, Texas. My second at Temple Beth Or in Washington Township, New Jersey. And now this incredible opportunity at the temple in Atlanta.
Wonderful. Welcome.
Thank you.
So glad you're here. I'm a son of Georgia and was educated and trained and ordained in Atlanta. So I feel like I'm a son of Atlanta. So on one level, although I've been away for many years, but on one level, I feel like I can welcome you. So welcome, Rabbi.
Thank you.
and I love the fact that you and I share so many deep friendships.
I know we know so many people in common, and everybody loves you. That's the greatest thing. Like you have such a fan club. It's amazing to hear.
Thank you. I love all those friends. The great thing about my 21 years in Pasadena, where I met so many of our common friends, is that we also were a very interfaith organization, and we had a marvelous sage who was Muslim, and he said, to be religious in the 21st century is to be interreligious.
Yes.
And I really believe that with all my heart.
Me too.
And that's the joy of being in Atlanta and experiencing something that really happened while I was away. I was ordained at St. Luke's for 35 years ago, or 36 now. And now St. Luke's is such an interreligious place with relationships with you. Although I must note that my experience of particularly Episcopal churches in the South, that Episcopal churches in large cities in the South always have this deep, abiding affinity with synagogues in the South.
In Dallas, that was the case when I was in Dallas too, yeah.
Yeah. I was in Jackson, Mississippi for a while, and that was the case there. And that certainly feels to be the case. And just to be putting things into the record, there is, from time to time, a strong to maybe weakened, but I think it's on the flow again, a thing called the corridor, the inner downtown corridor of congregations, faith communities. And so you and I are in that together.
Yeah, our congregations have a long and proud history of interfaith cooperation, and it's time to make it even stronger, right?
Indeed. Oh, no doubt of it. So, Rabbi, I love to be around rabbis, and I love to be around practicing Jews who really are focused in on the kind of the unique Jewish perspective on all of life, family life, worship life, but certainly life in the culture and in society. And I would just love to spend a few minutes of our time together hearing you articulate what that unique orientation to life, and it's not divorce from Christianity, because our leader died a Jew and rose a Jew, and on and on and on. So we are Jewish also, and it's certainly not devoid from the other Abrahamic religion. But if you would just kind of flesh that out a little bit, how do you see life because you are Jewish?
That's a great question. Of course, I can't get past the initial statement, I like to be around rabbis. I don't hear that too often. That's a great one. No, I think it's true. Rabbis often like to think about life through a Jewish lens on the one hand, but I will also add, certainly from my tradition, from our Reformed tradition, also see life through a universal lens as well, and see ourselves all as children of one God. And I actually think part of the unique idea about Judaism is trying to look through those two lenses at the same time. What is particular about being Jewish, and what is universal about being Jewish and about being, just a child of God. But there are some particularities. Jews often look at life through the prism of the past, meaning what have we learned from our history that helps to inspire our future? And we have suffered a lot of tragedy. I mean, anti-Semitism has been with us for more than 3,000 years. So so much of what's happening is reflected through that lens of anti-Semitism, and be it the Crusades or the plague, to have something relevant to today, or the Holocaust. I mean, there are tropes of anti-Semitism that have repeated throughout history, and they just don't stop. So that's certainly one area, but just also the lens of what we learned throughout history in general. We were exiled from the temple, and we had to learn how to live and reinvent ourselves anew again. And so that's a skill that Jews have just learned how to do over the centuries and passed on from generation to generation. A second is probably the way that we read the Bible and understand the Torah. And there are hermeneutic specific devices that Jews tend to use in the way that we read and interpret the Bible. And the most notable is the notion of a Hebrew word that is called Midrash, which means to search out. And the idea is that we take any given text in the Torah or in the Bible, and we ask three questions. How is it relevant, or how was it relevant in biblical times? What did it mean in its day? Two, how has it been understood over the years by rabbis and scholars at every juncture of life, in medieval times, in Spain, in France, in Germany, and what does it mean to us today, right? How does that same biblical text, what did it mean to the ancient listener, to someone in France in medieval times, and what does it mean today in the middle of COVID-19, the same biblical text? So I think, there's a unique lens to the way we read. And, I could do this forever, I won't, but I'll add one more, which is, of course, Israel, and sort of this notion of a homeland for not only the Jewish people, but so many religious groups consider denominations and sects Israel a homeland. And how can it be the only homeland for the Jewish people, but also be a religious and holy place that so many people call home? Yeah. So, those are three just to get the ball rolling.
Yeah. And so if you don't mind, let me toss it back to you.
Yeah.
So three associations that I have with Judaism. Well, I mean, I could go on and on. They're more now crowding my brain.
Me too.
But where do you put the Exodus in? It seems to me that is such a central hermeneutic lens through which Jews interpret everything. Thank God.
Yeah. So what's interesting about the Exodus experience, which in the scope of the Torah, is from Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. All of the Torah minus Genesis is consumed by the Exodus story.
Yeah.
So for us, it's the definitive Jewish narrative. And, our entire theology, to some extent, is bound up in the Exodus narrative. Right? This idea, some people call it liberation theology, right? But this idea that we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and God set us free. And the question is, what can we learn from that? That idea. Certainly, that we should have no idols. That idolatry and enslavement are intertwined. But that we should get to the essence continually of knowing God and doing justice. And that means that there's slavery in the world today, and people who need to be set free. And that we have an obligation to do that work because it's our core story. And so, for example, when the temple started working on the issue of preventing human trafficking of minors, which by now we all know is one of the worst, cities in the world for human trafficking. The theological frame for doing that work is the Exodus story, because these are young minors who are literally enslaved and need to be set free. What's interesting about this liturgically is that it's not limited, as one might think, just to the Passover experience when we have our seders and retell the story, but all of Jewish liturgy, every service, a weekday service, a Friday night service, Shabbat service, a Saturday morning Shabbat service, all the holidays have utilized a line from the Bible, from Exodus: "Who is like you, eternal God, among all the gods that are worshipped?" And we sing it in Hebrew, and it reminds us that this responsibility is ongoing. It's our core essence.
Yeah. The other, so thank you. That I was taking notes. That'll preach, Rabbi. So watch out.
Uh-oh.
I'm the greatest derivative preacher in the world. So I'm quoting you.
We all are. We all are.
And the other, so the Exodus leading to justice, leading to liberation.
Yeah.
Also, I have this association with rabbis, this phrase, tikkun olam. So unpack that a little bit, please.
Sure.
Inviting you for another sermon right now.
Yeah, so tikkun olam comes from two Hebrew words. Tikkun, from the Hebrew verb litaken, which means to fix or repair, and olam, which is the Hebrew word for world, to fix and repair the world. And it comes from a Kabbalistic or a mystical idea that most Kabbalistic mystical ideas don't become mainstream, but it would be hard to imagine a Jewish concept that has become more mainstream than tikkun olam.
Right.
So, most people just take it on the simple value of the two words, which means our job is to fix and repair the world. And that's true, but it actually has a core theology, which goes back to this, the idea that it would take me a long time to explain. I'll just do it quickly. That vessels shattered, God's vessels shattered in the creation of the world, because there was no place to contain them. And it's this idea that God has to sort of take a step back in order to make room for humans to actually be humans. And so these vessels shatter, and these broken pieces are what has to be put back together again. So it has a mystical underpinning to it, but so many Jewish people of so many, of the four Jewish denominations, understand that tikkun olam, world repair, is one of our great missions.
Yeah.
And there's a saying in the Talmud that the world depends on three things: on Torah, which is learning; on avodah, which is worship; and on gemilut chasadim, which is acts of loving kindness, which we understand as world repair. Those are the three things on which the entire world stands.
And the National Episcopal Church has put out a kind of a scheme for us to use as we're living through this post George Floyd murder.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, it is learn, pray, and act, which actually
There you
is
go.
resonant with what you just said, you know?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you could attribute it to the year 200 in the Talmud.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But it's so, talk about George Floyd, but those issues and liberation theology and tikkun olam, that's why so many Jews care, as of course so many Episcopals do, about doing this work and really having tough conversations, because it's not, what's happening now is not right and not just. And
right.
Yeah, so
and there's all the healing and the liberation and
yeah,
the wrapped up in all of that, of course.
yeah. Theologically, from any faith tradition, this work is so critical.
Absolutely. Well, clearly we could spend 2 or 3 forums just talking theologically.
Yeah,
But let's do a little bit of Atlanta history.
sure.
So unfortunately, let me start over. Unfortunately, and this is not to be edited out, I like to put all my flaws in here. Unfortunately, bombing of synagogues has been a reality in America, and particularly in the South. And I'm very, very much acquainted with that in Jackson, Mississippi. But let's talk about Atlanta, because there were those infamous bombing of your temple. And if you could just describe that, and then I have a question to ask you that relates to today. But
Sure.
What happened?
In 1958, in October of 1958, the temple was bombed by white supremacists. It wasn't out of nowhere, in that Rabbi Rothschild of blessed memory had been delivering nonstop sermons on the issue of racial justice and integration. It became the core of his mission in Atlanta, which wasn't his mission when he first got here. He came here actually to bring more tradition to the Jewish community.
Wow.
He got here from Pittsburgh and saw what was happening. Everything I read suggests that he just couldn't believe what he saw. And he became close with Dr. King. And I mean, sermon after sermon after sermon after sermon, trying to help not just the congregation, but the city, because his sermons became very popular amongst the entire city, to try to help us make a difference. So white supremacists literally bombed the temple. Nobody was hurt, but there was significant damage. The churches in the Peachtree Corridor immediately came to stand with the temple and by the temple, including supporting in every way, opening up spaces for our worship and religious school. Janice Rothschild Blumberg, Rabbi Rothschild's widow, who's an active member of our community in her 90s today, said a long time ago that it was the bomb that healed. No. And in many ways, it's because of the way the community came together and because of the message that Rabbi Rothschild was able to communicate. And by the way, he gave a sermon from Isaiah, and none shall make them afraid, the very next Shabbat. Again, not disheartened about the work that we have to do on racial justice and integration. It was also the bomb that healed because Leo Frank was a member of the temple. And there was so much anti-Semitism, and it was so challenging and difficult to be Jewish during the Frank days that the temple bombing helped to heal the community. And this is Janice Blumberg's thesis. It helped to heal us in many, many ways. There's another story that I want to tell you real quick, because it's so incredible, from around the same time period, that so many people know the story of the bombing, but don't know as well this story, which you can find, by the way, in the Center for Civil and Human Rights. here in Atlanta. In 1964, Dr. King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
Right.
And the city had to figure out, how do we want to honor Dr. King, because he's ours, right? You know, we can take credit for Dr. King in Atlanta. But not that many people were anxious to do it. There were some ministers and Rabbi Rothschild, and eventually, with the help of Coca-Cola, were able to convince the business community that this was the right thing to do. Coca-Cola then and now, obviously, you know, is very influential.
Right.
And the first integrated dinner where black and white sat together, integrated, was in 1964 at this dinner to honor Dr. King for receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. And Rabbi Rothschild, who, you know, my predecessor, of course, Rabbi Alvin Sugarman, our emeritus, is in between us, and my teacher, Rabbi Rothschild presented a gift on behalf of the city of Atlanta, and I'll show you because it's right here. This is a copy of the program for the recognition dinner in 1964, and you can see, you know, the ministers that spoke, and
Wow.
Rabbi Rothschild. So it's such an important part of Atlanta history and our temple history that I had to throw that in.
Was that the famous dinner at the driving club?
No, this is at the Dinkler Hotel.
Oh, the
first integrated dinner at the that took place.
Wow. So thanks for that. I may, when we're back together, I just may walk down and get a copy of that.
Yeah, I'll make you a copy.
Dr. King is, such a North Star for me. So, but I'm going to stay with that period because a Christian hero in that time was Ralph McGill.
Mm-hmm.
And the series of articles that he wrote about the bombing of the temple, in which he pointed out something that I think is so crucial these days, is that there had developed an atmosphere or a climate that gave rise to that act of violence. It was an atmosphere, a systemic, climatized sense of anti-Semitism and white supremacy, which erupted in that. And I would just love for you to reflect on that, because, let me go ahead and put all my cards on the table. When we're talking about racism, and Robin DiAngelo is making a really important point of this when she talks about white fragility, to say that racism is not a moment, it's a system. Anti-Semitism is not a moment, it's a system. It is the water we swim in.
Yeah.
And I would just love for you to address that, not only practically in the life we're living right now, but it seems to me that my Jewish friends really have it in their hearts about the reality of systemic thinking and systemic evil.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you're so right about the Ralph McGill writing. For those who, like me, who didn't grow up here, to read those pieces, they're almost prophetic, and I would encourage everyone who's listening to find a way. I have copies of them, but I don't. I'm sure that you could probably get them at the archives of the.
No, you can Google them, and they're very accessible. Some of them to me are like reading a fine sermon. I mean, they're just, and they read that way, and I think it's important. He gets a lot of the credit for helping Atlanta to wake up in that time, and I'm so glad you pointed that out. And I also think that you're correct that there is systemic racism and systemic anti-Semitism, and it should be noted that it is both on the left and the right. I always say to people, don't worry about castigating the other side, whatever side you're on.
whatever your belief is, it's in both places,
Yeah.
and it's scary. Uh, um, but systemic also means that it's institutionalized, and it means that there's a lot of work to do. First and foremost in education, because it's so deeply rooted and so embedded in everything we are and everything we do that we don't even notice it. And it's everywhere. It's at all of our synagogues and churches. It's at all of our institutions, and nobody's free from it. And we have this time in which we live demonstrates to us the work that needs to be done. I will say that one of the things that we've really started to understand and learn is that white supremacy, in many ways, is at the root of so much of this evil. And people who are white supremacists are often anti-Semites and anti-gay and anti-immigrant and they don't like anyone except themselves.
Right.
And I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges that we face, is this notion of white supremacy in our world. And I feel like the prophetic language of the Rabbi Rothschilds and the Ralph McGills and the Dr. Kings today really has to speak out against all hatred, because we're all, I said it earlier, we're all children of one God, and it's what if we saw it as the world as God speaking, Arabic on Fridays and Hebrew on Saturdays and Latin on Sundays, or whatever the metaphor is. But we're all children of one God, and the pure hatred is so deeply systemic and problematic.
Yeah. Peter, what's the role of fear in hatred?
I think it's big, what happens is people, you like what you know and what you're familiar with, and what you're not familiar with, becomes fearful, and so then generally we see a kind of hatred, not somebody holding a flag with a swastika on it, just overt racism, right. But it's a different kind of racism, or a different kind of anti-Semitism, which is, a fear that other people who are not like you are moving into your neighborhood, or populating the school board, or whatever the case may be. And the best way to overcome that fear is to be in relationship with people, and to be in relationship not only with people that are similar to you, but people who are different from you. And it means different races, different genders, different religions. That's how we overcome a fear of people who are not like us. When you're in a relationship with someone and you know someone, you begin to empathize, and I think that makes I think it's something we all need to be doing.
Indeed. Well, again, we could stay there for a long time, but let's go to 2020.
Okay.
And I'm just gonna ask us to bracket COVID-19 for a second, and talk about the fact that you and I were involved virtually last Sunday, several Sundays ago, with Ebenezer. Another one of our sister congregations in the corridor, who are really leading in many, many ways. Particularly, I have in mind right now, the elimination of mass incarceration. But also there seems to be, from the predominantly African-American churches that I'm studying and have friends leading, there's some education and re-narration going on, and saying, let's make sure we know our history here.
Yeah.
This is the American history. And it was through your generosity that I was included in a prayer there and got to see my dear friend, Sharon Brous.
Yeah.
Yeah, so talk a little bit about what led to that moment, because clearly you are part of the connective tissue of justice making in Atlanta. And this is one of the areas.
Well,
Speak to that, please.
I thank you. I'm not sure that I don't know about but yeah. Well, first of all, we have an historic relationship with Ebenezer Baptist that goes back not only to the civil rights movement, but in recent years as well, with a pulpit exchange. But we began doing work together and really trying to involve the whole Atlanta faith community, but the whole Atlanta community in general, around a couple of issues. The first is record restriction work. Because what happens is there are hundreds of people, thousands, walking around in, let's just say Fulton County to start, may have a minor nonviolent criminal record. Let's say they shoplifted 15 years ago. And nobody's prosecuting, it's stuck in the system. And you know what happens when it's stuck in the system. You can't get a job, you can't get a house, you can't adopt a child, you can't travel, you can't get a loan, you're paralyzed. And so we started to ask, along with Ebenezer, what would happen if we could restrict these records that are never going to ever be prosecuted. And amazingly, the work has bipartisan support. At the time, the Democratic mayor and at the time, the Republican governor both supported that work. I'm saying at the time because they were different governors and mayors. And I think they do now as well. And so it really is interesting that there's not a political issue here. It's something we all agree with. And people would come in at 10 o'clock on Veterans Day, because we also tried to do this work for veterans. And an hour later at 11 o'clock, hundreds of people left with their record free and clear. Judges were in the temple and in Ebenezer signing. And we even advocated to get a law passed to make this automatic, which is now in play. So it's really, there's real momentum for it. The second, regarding incarceration itself, which you pointed to was the thrust of the program we were at, is that America is the mass incarceration of the world. And what that means in plain language is nobody puts more people in jail in the entire world than the United States. And that's tough to think about when you think about, some non-democratic countries, and what's going on. We are dramatically worse than that, and nobody comes an even close second. It's not like the next country is even close to the United States. It's not a good place to be. And Georgia puts more people in jail in America than any other state. So we have a lot of work to do. And we started putting together an initiative to end mass incarceration. We put on a national conference, the Temple and Ebenezer and Auburn Seminary in New York. Really, we had a few hundred people come to Atlanta to learn about this issue. And it's really from a faith perspective. We're really diving deep to try to understand why this should be the faith communities, if you believe in liberation theology, the faith communities, one of our top number one issues right now. And the tragic events that we have been witnessing with Rayshard Brooks and really brings to light these issues, and more people are getting involved in this work, and it's going to be very difficult. It's not easy, but I'm really proud of it, and I feel as strong as I've ever felt that this is the right thing for us to be doing.
Once again, Tikkun Olam, Exodus, liberation, justice shall you pursue.
Yeah, and this is just the work we can all roll up our sleeves and do together.
Indeed. So, Rabbi, you recently invited me to go sleep on the streets.
I did.
I loved that. So
Yeah.
tell that story, please.
Yeah, I was part of Leadership Atlanta a number of years ago, and a lot of my classmates from my Leadership Atlanta class are very involved in Covenant House. And Covenant House is this extraordinary organization in town that helps to move homeless teens into this incredible, beautiful facility and to give them the resources to no longer be on the streets. And it's really important. Boy, we're tying everything together tonight. It's really important with the human trafficking, because so many of the teens that are trying to escape life on the streets have been trafficked and have found a way to escape and are completely homeless. So Covenant House is this organization that supports them, and there is an executive sleep out. I've done it now for I think 5 years, maybe 6 years, where we raise money and we sleep out, and it's a substantial portion of the budget for Covenant House each year. And this year, for the first time, we're having a clergy team. So there are all these teams. It's based on industry. So there's the accountants team and the all these different business industries, but there's never been a clergy team, and the clergy are such an important part of Atlanta life. So we're going to have our first team. I hope you'll accept and join me. But we sleep out. We meet with the youth who live there, and it's a transformative day, not only in what we learn and experience and the interactions that we have, but in the money that we raise for Covenant House that is so desperately needed.
Yeah. Well, I'm taking every step so far. So I'll be with you in August on a Zoom meeting.
Yes, you'll learn more about it. So,
Yeah, exactly.
But we have a plan for doing this in the COVID safe way. So.
Yeah, good deal. Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up, but there are just 2 or 3 other things that I need to, say from the heart. The reason my wife and I live in Alabama, where we've never lived before, after I retired from 21 years in Southern California, and spending so many time, we had a rabbi in residence at our church.
Wow.
So Leonard Bierman of blessed memory, and of Leo Beck Temple in Bel Air, would have my wife Hope and me over for many Friday night meals and even some seders. And I've never met a Christian who's gone to a Seder who didn't say, "Oh, we must have a Seder all the time."
Right.
And I get that. The story of the narrative of liberation, of Exodus, is so important.
Yeah.
Oh, before I go on, I think I'll remember. This is the way my brain works now that I'm 72. I've got to come back and say, Rabbi, that the other day I was doing some contemplative reading, and Thomas Keating was talking about how oftentimes contemplative breakthroughs happen when we're in really tight places.
Yeah.
And being in tight places is huge in Judaism. And he went on to say something I'd never thought about. Doesn't Egypt mean tight place or restriction?
Yes, narrow. So Mitzrayim means a narrow place, and so Egypt is, if you look at the map, Egypt is narrow, but yes, it has a connotation of the narrow places, that getting out of the narrowness in our thinking and in our way of life. Yes.
Yeah. So he was making that point about how God is the God of getting us through narrow places. And when we're in a narrow place, and I was reading COVID-19, we haven't even talked about that much, but and then he said, But all of us get into the world by coming into the world through a narrow place.
Yeah.
And I've never made the biological connection.
Yeah, isn't that great? And
I mean, it's stunning.
and then
Now,
theologically, it connects Genesis, like the birth of the nation and the birth of Exodus and yeah. So yeah, I love it, love it, love it, love it.
all right, I'm having a glory attack here, and all that kind of stuff. Um, but to go on back to my friend's house and why we're in Alabama, at important points in those table liturgies, there comes the blessing of the children.
Yes.
Oh, Peter. And, we didn't have our grandchildren with us, in California. And I said, Hope, we are going to go live near our grandchildren so that we can have meals weekly to bless our. Say a word about that. That's so powerful.
Yeah. I'm going to say only a word because I wrote my rabbinic thesis on this. So I have about 900 pages on it. And if you can't sleep one night, I'll send it to you. It's the priestly blessing. It's Numbers chapter 6, right? May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the light of God's presence shine upon, right? It has other functions in Jewish tradition. So the reason it's called the priestly blessing is because it's the prayer that the priest would recite on behalf of the congregation. And in traditional services, it still operates in that way today. Our tradition, the Reformed tradition, has made it more inclusive so that everybody can bless each other. It doesn't just have to be hereditary from the priestly class. But the premise is that parents offer a special blessing to their children. And before we recite chapter 6 of Numbers, there's a special blessing for boys and a special blessing for girls, and then this sort of group blessing. And it's really very special. One of our rabbis just had a child this week, and so it was exciting to watch him and his wife bless their daughter for the first time. With this ancient blessing, and it occurs each and every week, and it's one of the highlights of our week, our Shabbat table at home.
So powerful.
Yeah.
And then just to sign off, we had this wonderful the world, because I do want to underscore something the point you made earlier, that Judaism was about universality as well. It is about a people, but particularly the prophets were so universal in absolutely everything they said. Nevertheless, so forget my claiming this poet as ours. He was a Roman Catholic Irish poet, John O'Donohue, and he has a book named "To Bless the Space Between Us."
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah.
And that we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to be aware that there's space between absolutely every group of people come together. And we have a responsibility to bless that space, because too frequently, he didn't get into the polarization trap that we live in. There's polarization and division. And you are a blesser of the space between you and me, and between the temple and St. Luke's, and in this conversation. And I'm deeply grateful for your blessing the space between us, Rabbi.
My friend, thank you for that. That's the nicest thing anybody's ever said. But I'm grateful for our relationship. I'm grateful for the relationship between our two religious institutions. And it was such an honor to be here today. This was so much fun. I forgot that we're talking to all these people. I feel like I'm just talking to you. It's great.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so very much. And thank everyone for tuning in. We will continue to have a marvelous relationship with Rabbi Peter Berg and the Temple. And we are thrilled that you were here today. Blessings, everyone. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.